In August 1972, the streets of Kampala filled with panic and disbelief. Idi Amin, Uganda's self-proclaimed conqueror of the British Empire, had just ordered the expulsion of the country's Asian population, about 60,000 people, most of them of Indian descent.
These Asians were brought by British here to Uganda. Therefore, the British and those they are responsible to look after those Asians, because I have got also difficulty in Uganda of economy.
They were given 90 days to leave. Families who had lived in Uganda for generations suddenly found themselves stateless. Their shops sealed, their schools closed, and their homes marked for seizure. Trains heading toward the Kenyan border were packed with mothers clutching children, young men burning documents, and elders silently staring at a land they would never see again. Among the thousands forced into exile was a young academic named Mahmood Mamdani, a Ugandan-born Indian who would later become one of Africa's most respected intellectuals. Decades later, his son, Zohran Mamdani, would grow up to become a state assemblyman in New York, a politician who now fights not just for survival, but for justice and representation in one of the most powerful cities in the world. This is the story of that arc, from exile to belonging, from loss to reinvention. It is the story of Indian Ugandans, a community uprooted by tyranny, but carried forward by resilience. To understand the journey of Indian Ugandans, we must begin long before Idi Amin, long before independence. In the late 19th century, as the British Empire expanded across East Asia, it needed labor to build its grandest project, the Uganda Railway. Between 1896 and 1901, the British brought over 32,000 Indian laborers, mostly from Gujarat and Punjab, to construct the railway from Mombasa to Lake Victoria. They were called coolies by the British, but they were in truth the engineers of empire. They laid tracks through forests, mountains, and swamps, facing lions, malaria, and grelling heat. Nearly 2,500 died in the process. When the railway was completed, some returned to India, but many stayed. They became traders, artisans, teachers, and clerks, forming the backbone of Uganda's emerging urban economy. By the 1930s, Indian Ugandans controlled much of the retail trade, textile industry, and small manufacturing, while Africans were largely confined to agriculture under colonial restrictions. To the British, this arrangement was convenient. To Africans, it was unjust. They saw the Indians as beneficiaries of colonial privilege, closer to the rulers than to the ruled. The seeds of resentment were planted long before independence. When Uganda gained independence in 1962, the new nation inherited a fractured society. Africans sought to reclaim the economy. Indians, who made up less than 2% of the population, controlled nearly 90% of the country's private business. They were citizens, but never fully accepted. Most had been born in Uganda, but carried British passports, a colonial safety net that would later determine their fate. They built temples, cinemas, and schools in Kampala, Jinja, and Mbale, yet Few intermarried or integrated deeply into African political life. Then came Idi Amin Dada, a military officer who seized power in 1971. Populist, erratic, and brutal, Amin cast himself as the voice of the real Ugandan. He accused the Asian community of sabotaging the economy and bleeding the nation dry. On August 4, 1972, he gave the order: all Asians must leave Uganda within 90 days. They are saboteurs. They are not true citizens. The world was stunned. Panic swept through Uganda's Asian community. Some tried to bribe officials to stay. Others destroyed family records to protect relatives. There were suicides, disappearances, and seizures of property. In less than 3 months, tens of thousands of Indian Ugandans, many of whom had known no other home, were forced onto planes and trucks, bound for Britain, Canada, Kenya, India, and the United States. Their departure reshaped Uganda's economy overnight. Shops were looted, banks collapsed, factories stood idle. Amin handed over abandoned businesses to his supporters, most of whom had no experience running them. Within a year, the economy plunged. For those expelled, life became a geography of uncertainty. Britain took in around 28,000 refugees. Canada resettled over 7,000. India opened its doors but offered little more than sympathy. Others scattered to Pakistan, the Gulf, and the United States. Among those displaced was Mahmood Mamdani, then a young political scientist and activist, born in Kampala in 1946 to Indian parents. He had grown up balancing 3 identities: Indian by heritage, African by birth, and British by colonization. In 1972, Amin's decree changed his life overnight. Mahmood was forced into exile, moving first to Britain, then to Tanzania, and later returning to Uganda after Amin's fall. His experiences of statelessness and exclusion would shape his scholarship on race, colonialism, and identity. In exile, he met and married Miranda Obadiah, a Ugandan woman of Jewish and Ghanaian descent. Their son, Zohran, was born years later in Kampala, but raised partly in New York, where Mahmood became a visiting professor. Zohran grew up with stories of exile, of his grandparents' displacement, of the fear that home could vanish overnight. And in 2020, when he won election to the New York State Assembly, he carried that legacy into politics. When asked what inspired his activism, he once said, "My family's story is about being told you don't belong and deciding to fight so others don't have to hear the same thing." In a way, Zohran Mamdani represents what became of the Indian Ugandan diaspora, a generation that transformed exile into agency and displacement into purpose. After 1972, the Indian Ugandan diaspora spread across continents, forming what one scholar called a global network of forced entrepreneurship. Britain absorbed the largest number of exiles, mostly those with British overseas citizenship. They arrived in Leicester, Birmingham, and London, often in freezing weather, penniless, and unwelcome. Local newspapers called them the Asian invasion. But within a decade, they rebuilt. In Leicester, Indian Ugandans opened textile shops, grocery stores, and small factories. By the 1980s, the city's once declining industrial base was revitalized by the very community Britain had feared would be a burden. Today, Leicester City is often called Britain's most multicultural city, a place where Diwali lights the same streets that once housed refugees. Canada's then Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, offered asylum to about 7,000 Ugandan Asians. They arrived to snow, language barriers, and bureaucratic hurdles, but also opportunity. Many became doctors, engineers, and business leaders. By the 1990s, Ugandan Asians had become one of Canada's most successful immigrant groups, with average household incomes exceeding the national average. India, the ancestral homeland, was for many the strangest destination. Generations removed from the subcontinent, Indian Ugandans arrived as outsiders, familiar in face, foreign in tongue. They settled in cities like Mumbai, Ahmedabad, and Delhi, often struggling to fit into a culture they knew only through memory. Many left again to the Gulf or the West. India was home in history, but not in feeling. The United States offered opportunity for reinvention. Some families settled in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, entering medicine, academia, and finance. Their children, like Zohran Mamdani, grew up navigating a complex identity: brown in America, African in heritage, South Asian in culture. The diaspora, scattered but connected, formed a global web of memory. Reunions, weddings, and WhatsApp groups became transnational. In places like London, Toronto, and Nairobi, Indian Ugandans rebuilt not just their businesses, but their communities. After Amin's overthrow in 1979, some Indian Ugandans began to return. President Yoweri Museveni, who came to power in 1986, invited them back, promising restitution. By the 1990s, a few families reclaimed properties, reopened shops, and re-established temples. Today, about 20,000 people of South Asian descent live in Uganda again. They run supermarkets, banks, and factories. Kampala's skyline, dotted with Gujarati-run hotels and Indian-owned pharmacies, stands as proof that history, though cruel, is rarely final. But the relationship remains delicate. The returnees are both welcomed and watched, symbols of economic success and of the old inequalities that once tore Uganda apart. In 2019, Museveni appointed an Indian Ugandan, Sudhir Ruparelia, as honorary consul of Nepal and praised the ancient community for restoring Uganda's economy. It was a reconciliation, but one haunted by memory. What does it mean to belong when your history has no single homeland? For Indian Ugandans, belonging has become an act of synthesis. In Leicester's temples, prayers are chanted in Gujarati and Swahili. In Toronto's restaurants, samosas are served with Ugandan pili-pili sauce. In New York, Zohran Mamdani speaks English with the cadence of a Bronx native, yet carries the stories of Kampala in his heart. The Indian Ugandan diaspora embodies what scholars call multiple marginality, being Indian in Africa, African in the West, and foreign in all. But within that marginality, they have built bridges of meaning. They fund charities in Uganda, run exchange programs, and preserve oral histories. Their identity is not divided. It is layered. As Mahmood Mamdani once wrote, "We are all defined by where we are told we don't belong." For this community, exile became the source of creativity. Their children became writers, academics, doctors, and politicians. People like Zohran, who now fight for immigrants, tenants, and working-class New Yorkers. His work in Queens, representing one of the most diverse districts in America, mirrors his family's story. The belief that diversity itself can be a form of strength. The story of Indian Ugandans is not only about loss. It is about what exile teaches a people. It shows that displacement can forge resilience, that the experience of rejection can deepen empathy, and that home is not always a place. Sometimes it is a memory carried forward. When Zohran Mamdani stands on the floor of the New York State Assembly, speaking about housing justice, labor rights, or racial equity, he channels the legacy of those who lost everything in 1972. He is a bridge between continents and generations, a reminder that what was once called exile can, over time, become a form of belonging. The Indian Ugandan story is also a cautionary tale. It reminds us how easily citizenship can be stripped away, how fragile inclusion can be, and how the politics of belonging can turn neighbor against neighbor. But it also shows that identity once scattered can be rebuilt through memory, work, and imagination. In 2020, when Zohran Mamdani took his oath of office in New York, his mother posted a photo online. A Ugandan Indian Jewish family standing together, smiling in a city that had once been a distant dream. The caption reads simply, "From exile to service." That image captures the essence of this journey. From the railway workers of Mombasa, to the merchants of Kampala, to the refugees of Leicester and Toronto, to the Assemblyman in Queens, the line of history bends, but it does not break. 50 years after Idi Amin's expulsion, the descendants of those displaced are rebuilding nations across the world. They are professors and politicians, artists and entrepreneurs. They carry Swahili words in their speech, Indian spices in their kitchens, and Ugandan warmth in their hearts. Their history proves something profound, that exile is not the end of belonging. It is its reinvention. That even when a people are scattered, they can reassemble themselves around values stronger than geography, work, memory, and dignity. And perhaps, in a way, that is the real inheritance of Zohran Mamdani's generation. They are the children of those who were told to leave, yet found ways to belong everywhere. They are the living testimony that from exile can come identity, and from loss can come purpose.